The reader of books. It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine. They still think that he or she is wonderful. Some parents go further. They become so blinded by adoration they manage to convince themselves their child has qualities of genius. Well, there is nothing very wrong with all this. It's the way of the world. It is only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin, we're going to be sick." School teachers suffer a good deal from having to listen to this sort of twaddle from proud parents. But they usually get their own back when the time comes to write the end of term reports. If I were a teacher, I would cook up some real scorchers for the children of doing parents. Your son Maximilian, I would write, is a total washout. I hope you have a family business you can push him into when he leaves school, because he sure as heck won't get a job anywhere. Or, if I were feeling lyrical that day, I might write, it's a curious truth that grasshoppers have their hearing organs in the sides of the abdomen. Your daughter Vanessa, judging by that she's learned this term, has no hearing organs at all. I might even delve deeper into natural history and say the periodical cicada spent 6 years as a grub underground, and no more than 6 days as a free creature of sunlight and air. Your son Wilfred has spent 6 years as a grub in this school, and we are still waiting for him to emerge from syphilis. A particularly poisoner little girl might sting me into saying, Fiona has the same glass cell beauty as an iceberg, but unlike the iceberg, she has absolutely nothing below the surface. I think I might enjoy writing end-of-term reports for the stinkers in my class. But enough of that. We will get on. Occasionally, one comes across parents who take the opposite line, who show no interest in their children, and these of course are far worse than the doting ones. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were two such parents. They had a son called Michael and a daughter called Matilda, and the parents looked upon Matilda in particular as nothing more than a scab. A scab is something you have to put up with until the time comes when you can pick it off and flick it away. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood looked forward enormously to the time when they could pick their little daughter off and flick her away, preferably into the next country or even farther than that. It is bad enough when parents treat ordinary children as though they were scabs and bunions, but it becomes somehow a lot worse when the child in question is extraordinary, and by that I mean sensitive and brilliant. Her mind was so nimble, and she was so quick to learn the ability should have been obvious even to the most half-written of parents. But Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were both so harmless and so wrapped up in their own silly little lives that they failed to notice anything unusual about their daughter. To tell the truth, I doubt they would have noticed had she crawled into the house with a broken leg. Matilda's brother Michael was a perfectly normal boy. But the sister, as I said, was something to make your eyes pop. By the age of 1.5, her speech was perfect, and she knew as many words as most grown-ups. The parents, instead of applauding her, called her a noisy chatterbox and told her sharply that a small girl should be and not hurt. By the time she was 3, Matilda had taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well, and she naturally began hankering after books. The only book in the whole of this enlightened household was something called Easy Cooking, belonging to her mother. And when she had read this from cover to cover and had learned all the recipes by heart, she decided she wanted something more interesting. "Daddy," she said, "do you think you could buy me a book?" "A book?" he said. "What do you want a flaming book for?" "To read, Daddy." "What's wrong with the telly, for heaven's sake? We've got a lovely telly with a 12-inch screen, and now you come asking for a book? You're getting spoiled, my girl." Nearly every weekday afternoon Matilda was left alone in the house. Her brother, 5 years older than her, went to school. Her father went to work, and her mother went out playing bingo in town 8 miles away. Mrs. Wormwood was hooked on bingo and played it 5 afternoons a week. On the afternoon of the day when her father had refused to buy her a book, Matilda set out all by herself to walk to the public library in the village. When she arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. She asked if she might sit a while and read a book. Mrs. Phelps, slightly taken aback at the arrival of such a tiny girl unaccompanied by a parent, nevertheless told her she was very welcome. "Where are the children's books, please?" Matilda asked. "They are over there on those lower shelves," Mrs. Phelps told her. "Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of pictures in it?" "No, thank you," Matilda said. "I'm sure I can manage." From then on, every afternoon, as soon as her mother had left for bingo, Matilda would toddle down to the library. She walk took only 10 minutes, and this allowed her 2 glorious hours, sitting quietly by herself in a cozy corner, devouring one book after another. When she had read every single children's book in the place, she started wandering around in search of something else. Mrs. Phelps, who had been watching her with fascination for the past few weeks, now got up from her desk and went over her. "Can I help you, Matilda?" she asked. "I'm wondering what to read next," Matilda said. "I've finished all the children's books." "You mean you've looked at the pictures?" "Yes, but I've read the books as well." Mrs. Phelps looked down at Matilda from her great height, and Matilda looked right back at her. "I thought some very poor," Matilda said, "but others were lovely. I liked The Secret Garden." Best of all, it was full of mystery, the mystery of the room behind the closed door and the mystery of the garden behind the big wall. Miss Phelps was stunned. "Exactly how old are you, Matilda?" she asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phelps was more stunned than ever, but she had the sense now to show it. "What sort of a book would you like to read next?" she asked. Matilda said, "I'd like a really good one that grown-ups read. A famous one. I don't know any names." Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown-up book for a 4-year-old girl? Her first thought was to pick a young teenager's romance, one of kind that is written for 15-year-old schoolgirls, but for some reason she found herself instinctively walking past a particular shelf. "Try this," she said at last. "It's very famous and very good. If it's too long for you, just let me know and I'll find something shorter and a bit easier." Great Expectations, Matilda read, by Charles Dickens. "I'd love to try it." "I must be mad," Miss Phelps told herself. But to Matilda she said, "Of course, you may try it." Of the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eye from the small girl sitting for hour after an hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room with a book of her lap. It was necessary to rest in on the lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up, which meant she had to sit leaning forward in order to read. And a strange sight it was, this tiny dark-haired person sitting there with her feet nowhere near touching the floor, totally absorbed in the wonderful adventures of Pip and old Miss Havisham and her cobweb house by the spell of magic that Dickens, the great storyteller, had woven with his books. The only movement from the reader was the lifting of the hand every now and then to turn over the page, and Miss Phelps always felt sad when time came for her to cross the floor and say, "It's 10 to 5, Matilda." During the first week of Matilda's visit, Mrs. Phelps had said to her, "Does your mother walk you down here every day and take you home?" "My mother goes to Elipsbury every afternoon to play bingo," Matilda had said. "She doesn't know I come here." "But that's surely not right," Mrs. Phelps said. "I think you better ask her." "I'd rather not," Matilda said. "She doesn't encourage reading books, nor does my father. But what do I expect you to do every afternoon in an empty house? Just mooch around and watch the telly." "I see. She doesn't really care what I do," Matilda said, a little sadly. Mrs. Phelps was concentrated about the child's safety on the walk through the fairly busy village high street and the crossing of the road, but she decided not to interfere. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which is that edition contained 411 pages. "I love it," she said to Miss Phelps. Has Mr. Dickens written any others? A great number, said the astounded Miss Phelps. Shall I choose you another? Over the next 6 months, under Mrs. Phelps' watchful and compassionate eye, Matilda read the following books: Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Tess of the D.U. Belvilles by Thomas Hadley, Gone to Earth by Mary Webb, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, The Good Companions by G.B. Priestley, The Brighton Rock by Canon Green, Animal Farm by George Orwell. It was a formidable list, and by now Miss Phelps was filled with wonder and excitement, but it was probably a good thing that she did not allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Almost anywhere else, witnessing the achievements of this small child would have been tempted to make a great fuss and shout the news all over the village and beyond, but not so Mrs. Phelps. She was someone who minded her own business and had long since discovering it was seldom worthwhile to interfere with other people's children. Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her, especially about men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way he tells it, I feel I'm right there on the spot watching it all happen. A fine writer will always make you feel that, Mrs. Phelps said, and don't worry about the bits you can understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you, like music. I will. Did you know, Miss Phelps said, that the public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home? I didn't know that, Matilda said. Could I do it? Of course, Miss Phelps said. When you have chosen the book you want, bring it to me so I can make a note of it. And it's yours for 2 weeks. You can take more than one if you wish. From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and then she would sit and read most afternoons, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. She was not quite tall enough to reach things around the kitchen, but she kept a small box in the outhouse, which she brought, and it stood on in order to get whatever she wanted. Mostly it was hot chocolate she made, warming the milk in a saucepan of the stove before mixing it. Occasionally she made bovril of Ovaltine. It was pleasant to take a hot drink up to her room and have it beside her as she sat in her silent room reading it, The Empty House, in the afternoons. The books transport her into new worlds and introduce her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on an olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She traveled all over the world while sitting in her room in an English village. Mr. Wormwood, the great car dealer. Matilda's parents owned quite a nice house with 3 bedrooms upstairs, while on the ground floor there was dining room and a living room and a kitchen. Her father was a dealer in second-hand cars, and it seemed he did pretty well at it. Sawdust, Hugh said proudly, is one of the great secrets of my success, and it costs me nothing. I get it free from the sawmill. What do you use it for? Matilda asked him. Ha, the father said. Would you like to know? I don't see the sawdust can help you to sell second-hand cars, Daddy. That's because you're an ignorant little twit, the father said. His speech was never very delicate, but Matilda was used to it. She also knew that he liked to boast, and she wouldn't egg him on shamelessly. You must be very clever to find a use for something that costs nothing, she said. I wish I could do it. You couldn't, the father said. You are too stupid. But I don't mind telling young Mike here about a scene. He'll be joining me in the business one day. Ignoring Matilda, he turned to his son and said, I am always glad to buy a car when some fool has been crushing the gears so badly they are all worn out and rattle like mad. I get it cheap. Then all I do is mix a lot of sawdust with the oil in the gearbox, and it turns as sweet as a nut. How long will it run like before it starts rattling again? Matilda said and asked him. Long enough for the buyer to get a good distance away, the father said, grinning. About 100 miles. But that's dishonest, Daddy, Matilda said. It's cheating. No one ever got rich being honest, the father said. Customers are there to be diddled. Mr. Wormwood was a small, ratty-looking man whose front teeth stuck out underneath a thin, ratty moustache. He liked to wear a jacket with large, brightly colored checks, and he sported ties that were usually yellow or paint green. Now, take mileage for instance, he went on. Anyone who buys a second-hand car, the first thing you want to know is how many miles it's done, right? Right, the son said. So I buy an old dump that's got about 150,000 miles on the clock. I get it cheap, but no one's going to buy it with a mileage like that, are they? And these days, you can't take the speedometer out and fiddle the numbers back like you used to 10 years ago. They fixed it so it's impossible to tamper with it unless you're a ruddy watchmaker or something. So what do? I use my brains, laddie. That's what I do. How? Young Michael asked, fascinated. He seemed to have inherited his father's love of croquet. I sit down and say to myself, how can I convert a mileage reading on 150,000 into a 10,000 without taking a speedometer to pieces? Well, if I were to run the car backwards for long enough, then obviously that would do it. The numbers would cling backwards, wouldn't they? But who is going to drive a flaming car in reverse for thousands and thousands of miles? You couldn't do it. Of course I couldn't do it, young Michael said. So I scratch my head, the father said. I use my brains. When you've been given a fine brain like I have, you've got to use it. And all of a sudden, the answer hits me. I tell you, I felt exactly like the other brilliant fellow must have felt when he discovered penicillin. Eureka! I cried. I've got it! What did you do, Dad? The son asked him. The speedometer, Mr. Wormwood said. It's run off a cable that is coupled up to one of the front wheels. So first I disconnect the cable where it joins in the front wheel. Next, I get one of those high-speed electric drills and I couple that up to the end of the cable in such a way that once the drill turns, it turns the cable backwards. You got me so far? You following me? Yes, Daddy, young Michael said. These drills run at a tremendous speed, the father said, so when I switch on the drill, the mileage numbers of the speedo spin backwards at a fantastic rate. I can clock 50,000 miles off the clock in a few minutes with my high-speed electric drill, and by the time I finished, the car has only done 10,000 and it's ready for sale. She's almost new, I say to the customer. She's hardly done 10 though, belonging to an old lady who only used it once a week for shopping. Can you really turn the mileage back with an electric drill? Young Michael asked. I'm telling you trade secrets, the father said, so don't you go talking about this to anyone else. Don't you want me put in jail, do you? I won't tell a soul, the boy said. Do you do this so many cars, Dad? Every single car that comes through my hands get a treatment, the father said. They all have their mileage too cut to under 10 though before they are offered for sale, and so think I invented it all by myself, he added proudly. It's made me a mint. Matilda, who had been listening closely, said, But Daddy, that's even more dishonest than the sawdust. It's disgusting. You're cheating people who trust you. If you don't like it, then don't eat the food in this house, the father said. It's bought with the profits. It's dirty money, Matilda said. I hate it. 2 red spots appeared on the father's cheeks. Who the heck do you think you are? He shouted. The Archbishop or Canterbury of something, preaching to me about honesty? You are just an ignorant little skirt who hasn't the foggiest idea what you are talking about. Quite right, Harry, the mother said, and to Matilda she said, You've got a nerve talking to your father like that. Now keep your nasty mouth shut so we can all watch this program in peace. They were in the living room eating their suppers on their knees in front of the telly. The suppers were TV dinners in floppy aluminium containers with separate containments for stewed meal, the boiled potatoes, and the peas. Mrs. Wormwood sat munching her meal with her eyes glued to the American soap opera on the screen. She was a large woman whose hair was dyed platinum blonde, except when you could see the mossy brown beads growing out of the roots. She wore heavy makeup, and she had one of those unfortunate bulging fingers where the flesh appears to be strapped in all around the body to prevent it from falling down. "Mummy," Matilda said, "would you mind if I ate my supper in the dining room so I could read my book?" The father glanced up sharply. "I would mind," she snapped. "Supper's a family gathering, and no one leaves the table till it's over." "But we are not at the table," Matilda said. "We never are. We are always sitting off our knees and watching the telly." "What's wrong with watching the telly, may I ask?" the father said. His voice had suddenly become soft and dangerous. Matilda didn't trust herself to answer him, so she kept quiet. She could feel the anger boiling up inside her. She knew it was wrong to hate her parents like this, but she was finding it very hard not to do so. All the reading she had done had given her a view of the life that they had never seen. If only they would read a little Dickens or Kipling, they would soon discover there was more to life than cheating people and watching television. Another thing, she resented being told constantly that she was ignorant and stupid when she knew she wasn't. The anger inside her went on boiling and boiling, and as she lay in her bed at night, she made a decision. She decided that every time her father or mother was beastly to her, she would get her own back in some way or another. A small victory or two would help her to tolerate their idiocies and would stop her from going crazy. You must remember that she was still hardly 5 years old, and it is not easy for somebody as small as to score points against an all-powerful grown-up. Even so, she was determined to have a go. Her father, after what had happened in front of the telly that evening, was the first on her list. The hat and the superglue. The following morning, just before the father left for his busy second-hand car garage, Matilda slipped into the cloakroom and got hold of the hat he wore each day to work. She had to stand on her toes and reach up as high as she could with a walking stick in order to hook the hat off the peg, and even when she only just made it. The hat itself was one of those flat-topped pork-pie jobs with jazz feather stuck in the handband, and Mr. Wormwood was very proud of it. He thought it gave him a rakish, daring look, especially when he wore it an angle with his loud-cheeked jacket and green tie. Matilda, holding the hat in one hand and a thin tube of superglue in the other, proceeded to squeeze a line of glue very neatly all around inside rim of the hat. Then she carefully hooked the hat back onto the back with a walking stick. She timed this operation very carefully, applying the glue just as her father was getting up from the breakfast table. Mr. Wormwood didn't notice anything when he put the hat on, but when he arrived at the garage, he couldn't get it off. Superglue is very powerful stuff, so powerful it will take your skin off if you pull too hard. Mr. Wormwood didn't want to be scalped, so he had to keep the hat on his head the whole day long, even when putting sandwiches in gear boxes and finding the miggles of cars with his electric drill. In an effort to save face, he adopted a casual attitude, hoping that his staff would think that he actually meant to keep his hat on all day long, just for the knack of it, like gangsters do in the films. When he got home that evening, he still couldn't get the hat off. "Don't be silly," his wife said. "Come here, I'll take it off for you." She gave the hat a sharp yank. Mr. Wormwood let out a yell that rattled the window panes. "Ow!" he screamed. "Don't do that! Let it go! You'll take half the skin off my forehead." Matilda, nestling in her usual chair, was watching this performance over the rim of her book with some interest. "What's the matter, Daddy?" she asked. "Has your head suddenly swollen or something?" The father glared at his daughter with deep suspicion, but said nothing. How could he? Mrs. Wormwood said to him, "It must be super glue. It couldn't be anything else. They'll teach you to go playing around with nasty stuff like that. I expect you were trying to stick another feather in your head." "I haven't touched the flaming stuff," Mr. Wormwood shouted. He turned and looked again at Matilda, who looked back at him with large, innocent brown eyes. Mrs. Wormwood said to him, "You should read the label on the tube before you start messing with dangerous products. Always follow the instructions on the label." "What in heaven's name are you talking about, you stupid witch?" Mr. Wormwood shouted, clarting the brim of his hat to stop anyone trying to pull it off again. "Do you think I'm so stupid I'd glue this thing to my head on purpose?" Matilda said, "There is a boy down the road who got some super glue on his finger without knowing it, and then he put his finger to his nose." Mr. Wood jumped. "What happened to him?" He sluttered. "The finger got stuck inside his nose," Matilda said, "and he had to go around like that for a week. People kept saying to him, 'Stop picking your nose,' and he couldn't do anything about it. He looked an awful fool." "Serve him right," Mrs. Wormwood said. "He shouldn't have put his finger up there in the first place. It's a nasty habit. If all children had super glue put on their fingers, they'd soon stop doing it." Matilda said, "Grown-ups do it too, Mummy. I saw you doing it yesterday in the kitchen." "That's quite enough from you," Mrs. Wormwood said, turning pink. Mr. Wormwood had to keep his hat on all through supper in front of the television. He looked ridiculous, and he stayed very silent. When he went up to bed, he tried again to get the thing off, and so did his wife, but it couldn't budge. "How am I going to have my shower?" he demanded. "You'll just have to do without it, won't you?" his wife told him, and later on, as she watched her skinny little husband sulking around the bedroom in his purple striped pajamas with a pork pie hat on his head, she thought how stupid he looked. Hardly the kind of man a wife dreams about, she told herself. Mr. Wormwood discovered that the worst thing about having a permanent hat on his head was having to sleep in it. It was impossible to lie comfortably on the pillow. "Now to stop fussing around," his wife said to him after he had been tossing and turning for about an hour. I expect it will be loose by morning, and then it'll slip off easily. But it wasn't loose by the morning, and it wouldn't slip off. Mrs. Wormwood took a pair of scissors and cut the things off his head, bit by bit. First the top, and then the brim. Then the inner band had stuck to the heart, and around the sides and back she had to chop the hair off, ring to the skin, so that he finished up with a bold white ring round his head, like some sort of a monk. And in the front, where the bang had stuck directly to the bare skin, there remained a whole lot of small patches of brown leathery stuff that no amount of washing would get off. At breakfast, Matilda said to him, "You must try to get those bits off your forehead, Daddy. It looks as though you've got little brown insects crawling about all over you. People will think you've got lice." "Be quiet," the father snapped. "Just keep your nasty mouth shut, will you?" All in all, it was a most satisfactory exercise, but it was surely too much to hope that it had taught the father a permanent lesson. The ghost. There was comparative calm in the Wormwood household for about a week after the super-glue episode. The experience had clearly chanced it by Mrs. Wormwood, and he seemed temporarily to have lost his taste for boasting and bowing. Then suddenly he stuck again. Perhaps he had a bad day in the garage, and he had not sold enough crummy second-hand cars. There are many things that make a man irritable when he arrives home from work in the evening, and a sensible wife will usually notice the storm signals and will leave him alone until he simmers down. When Mr. Wormwood arrived back from the garage that evening, in his face was a dark and thundercloud, and somebody was clearly for the high jump pretty soon. His wife recognized the signs immediately and made herself grace. He then strode into the living room. Matilda happened to be curled up in an armchair in the corner, totally absorbed in a book. Mr. Wormwood switched on the television. The screen lit up. The program blared. Mr. Wormwood glared at Matilda. She hadn't moved. She had somehow trained herself by now to block her ears to the ghastly sound of the dreaded box. She kept right of reading, and for some reason this infuriated the father. Perhaps his anger was intensified because he saw her getting pleasure from something that was beyond his reach. "Don't you ever stop reading?" he snapped at her. "Oh, hello, Daddy," she said pleasantly. "Did you have a good day?" "What's in this trash?" he said, snatching the book from her hands. "It isn't trash, Daddy. It's lovely. It's called The Red Pony. It's by John Steinbeck, an American writer. Why don't you try it? You will love it." "Filth," the Mr. Wormwood said. "If it's by an American, it's certain to be filth. That's all they write about." "No, Daddy, it's beautiful. Honestly, it's about... I don't want to know. What is it about?" Mr. Wormwood braved. "I'm fed up with your reading anyway. Go and find yourself something useful to do." for the frightening sadness. He now began ripping the pages out of the book in handfuls and throwing them in the waste paper basket. Matilda froze in horror. The father kept going. There seemed little doubt that the man felt some kind of jealousy. "How dare she?" he seemed to be saying with each ripe of page. "How dare she enjoy reading books when he couldn't? How dare she?" "That's a library book," Matilda cried. "It doesn't belong to me. I have to return it to Mrs. Phelps." "Then you have to buy another one, won't you?" the father said, still tearing over pages. "You'll have to save your pocket money until there's enough in the kitty to buy a new one for your precious Miss Phelps, won't you?" With that he dropped the now empty covers of the book into the basket and marched out of the room, leaving the telly blaring. Most children in Matilda's place would have burst into floods of tears. She didn't do this. She sat there still and white and thoughtful. She seemed to know that neither crying nor sulking ever got anyone anywhere. An only sensible thing to do when you're attacked is, as Napoleon once said, to counterattack. Matilda's wonderfully subtle mind was already at work devising yet another suitable punishment for the poisonous parent. The plan that was now beginning to hatch in her mind depended, however, upon whether or not Fred's parrot was really as good a stalker as Fred made out. Fred was a friend of Matilda's. He was a small boy of 6 who lived just around the corner from her, and for days he had been going on about this great talking parrot his father had given him. So the following afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Wormwood had departed in her car for another session of bingo, Matilda set out for Fred's house to investigate. She knocked on his door and asked if he would be kind enough to show her the famous bird. Fred was delighted and led her up to his bedroom, where a truly magnificent blue and yellow parrot sat in a tall cage. "There it is," Fred said. "Its name Chopper." "Make it talk," Matilda said. "You can't make it talk," Fred said. "You have to be patient. I'll talk when it feels like that." They hung around, waiting. Suddenly the parrot said, "Hello, hello, hello." It was exactly like a human voice. Matilda said, "That's amazing. What else can it say?" "Rattle my bones," the parrot said, giving a wonderful imitation of a spooky voice. "Rattle my bones." "He's always saying that," Fred told her. "What else can he say?" Matilda asked. "That's about it," Fred said. "But it's pretty marvelous, don't you think?" "It's fabulous," Matilda said. "Will you lend him to me just for one night?" "No," Fred said. "Certainly not." "I'll give you all my next week's pocket money," Matilda said. That was different. Fred thought about it for a few seconds. "All right then," he said, "if you promise to return him tomorrow." Matilda staggered back to her own empty house, carrying the tall cage in both hands. There was a large fireplace in the dining room, and she now set about wedging the cage up the chimney and out of sight. This wasn't so easy, but she managed it in the end. "Hello, hello, hello," the bird called down to her. "Hello, hello." "Shut up, you nut," Matilda said, and she went out to wash the soot off her hands. That evening, while the mother, the father, the brother, and Matilda were having supper as usual in the living room in front of the television, a voice came loud and clear from the dining room across the hall. "Hello, hello, hello," it said. "Harry," cried the mother, turning white, "there is someone in the house. I heard a voice." "So did I," the brother said. Matilda jumped up and switched on the telly. "Shh," she said. "Listen." They all stopped eating and said they were tense listening. "Hello, hello, hello," came voice again. "There it is," cried the brother. "It's burglars," hissed the mother. "They are in the dining room." "I think they are," the father said, sitting tight. "Then go and catch them, Harry," hissed the mother. "Go out and collar them red-handed." The father didn't move. He seemed in no hurry to dash off and be a hero. His face had turned grey. "Get on with it," hissed the mother. "They're probably after the silver." The husband wiped his lips nervously with his napkin. "Why don't we all go and talk together?" he said. "Come on, then," the brother said. "Come on, Mom." "They're definitely in the dining room," Matilda whispered. "I'm sure they are." The mother grabbed a poker from the fireplace. The father took a golf club that was standing in the corner. The brother seized a table lamp, ripping the plug out of his socket. Matilda took the knife she had been eating with, and all four of them crept towards the dining room door, the father keeping well behind the others. "Hello, hello, hello," came the voice again. "Come on," Matilda cried, and she burst into the room, brandishing her knife. "Stick them up," she yelled. "We've caught you." The others followed her, waving their weapons. Then they stopped. They stared around the room. There was no one there. "There was no one there," the father said, greatly revealed. "I heard him, Harry," the mother shrieked, still quaking. "I distinctly heard his voice. So did you?" "I'm certain I heard him," Matilda cried. "He's here, somewhere. I began searching behind the sofa and behind the curtains." Then came the voice once again, soft and spooky this time. "Rattle my bones," it said. "Rattle my bones." They all jumped, including Matilda, who was a pretty good actress. They stared around the room. There was still no there. "It's a ghost," Matilda said. "Heavens help us," cried the mother, clutching her husband round the neck. "I know it's a ghost," Matilda said. "I've heard it here before. This room is haunted. I thought you knew that." "Save us," the mother screamed, almost throttling her husband. "I'm getting out of here," the father said, grayer than ever now. They all fled, slamming the door behind. The next afternoon, Matilda managed to get a rather sooty and grumpy parrot down from the chimney and out of the house without being seen. She carried it through the back door and ran with all the way for Fred's house. "Did it behave itself?" Fred asked her. We had a lovely time with it, Matilda said. My parents adored it. Arithmetic. Matilda longed for her parents to be good and loving and understanding and honorable and intelligent. The fact that they were none of these things was something she had to put up with. It was no easy to do, but the new game she had invented of punishing one or both of them each time they were beastly to her made her life more or less bearable. Being very small and very young, the only power Matilda had over anyone in her family was brain power. For sheer cleverness, she could run rings around them all. But the fact remained that any 5-year-old girl in any family was always obligated to do as she was told, however asinine the others might be. Thus she was always forced to eat her evening meals out of TV dinner trays in front of the dreaded box. She always had to stay along on a weekday afternoons, and whenever she was told to shut up, she had to shut up. Her safety valve, the thing that prevented her from going round the bend, was the fun of devising and dishing out these blinding punishments, and the lovely thing was that they seemed to work at any rate for short periods. The father in particular became less cocky and unbearable for several days after receiving a dose of Matilda's magic medicine. A parrot in the chimney affair quite definitely cooled both parents down a lot, and for over a week they were comparatively civil to their small daughter. But alas, this couldn't last. The next flare-up came one evening in the sitting room. Mr. Wormwood had just returned from work. Matilda and her brother were sitting quietly on the sofa, waiting for their mother to bring in the TV dinner on a tray. The television had not yet been switched on. In came Mr. Wormwood in a loud check suit and a yellow tie. The paling broad orange and green check of the jacket and trousers almost blinded the onlooker. He looked like a low-grade bookmaker dressed up for his daughter's wedding, and he was clearly very pleased with himself this evening. He sat down in an armchair and rubbed his hands together and addressed his son in a loud voice. "Well, my boy," he said, "your father's had a most successful day. He is a lot richer tonight than he was this morning. He has sold no less than 5 cars, each one a tidy profit. Sawdust in the gearboxes, the electric drill of the speedometer cables, a splash of paint here and there, and a few others clever little tricks, and the idiots were all failing over themselves to buy." He finished a bit of paper from his pocket and studied it. "Listen, boy," he said, addressing the son and ignoring Matilda, "seeing as you'll be going into this business with me one day, you've got to know how to add up the profits you make at in the end of each day. Go and get yourself a pad and a pencil, and let's see how clever you are." The son obediently left from room and returned with the writing materials. "Write down these figures," the father said, reading from his bit of paper. Car number 1 was bought by me for £278 and sold for 1,425. Got that? The 10-year-old boy wrote the two separate amounts down slowly and carefully. Car number 2, the father went on, cost me £180 and sold for 760. Got it? Yes, Dad, the son said. I've got it. Car number 3 cost £111 and sold for £999. Say that again, the son said. How much did you sell for? £999.50, the father said. And that, by the way, is another of my nifty little tricks to diddle the customer. Never ask for a big round figure, always go just below it. Never say £1,000, always say £999.50. It sounds much less, but it isn't. Clever, isn't it? Very, the son said. You're brilliant, Dad. Car number cost £486, a real wreck that was, and sold for £699.50. Not too fast, the son said, writing the numbers down. Right, I've got it. Car number 5 cost £637 and sold for £1,649.50. You got all those figures written down, son? Yes, Daddy, the boy said, crouching over his bed and carefully writing. Very well, the father said. Not work out the profit I made on each of 5 cars and add up the total. When you be able to tell me how much money your brilliant father made altogether today? That's a lot of sums, the boy said. Of course it's a lot of sums, the father answered. But when you are in a big business like I am, you've got to be hot stuff at arithmetic. I've practically got a computer inside my head. It took me then 10 minutes to work the whole thing out. You mean you did it on your head, Dad? The son asked, goggling. Well, not exactly, the father said. Nobody could do that, but it didn't take me long. When you're finished, tell me that you think my profit was for the day. I've got the final total written down here, and I'll tell you if you're right. Matilda said quietly. Dad, you make exactly £4,303.50 altogether. Don't butt in, the father said. Your brother and I are busy with high finance. But Dad, shut up, the father said. Stop guessing and trying to be clever. Look at your answer, Dad, Matilda said gently. You've done it right. It ought to be £4,303.50. Is that what you've got, Dad? The father glanced down at the paper in his hand. He seemed so stiffened. He became very quiet. There was a silence. Then he said, Say that again. £4,303.50, Matilda said. There was another silence. The father's face was beginning to dark red. I'm sure it's all right, Matilda said. You little cheat, the father suddenly shouted, pointing at her with his finger. You looked at my bit of paper. You read it off from that I've got written here. Daddy, I'm the other side of the room, Matilda said. How could I possibly see it? Don't give me that rubbish, the father shouted. Of course you looked. You must have looked. No one in the world could give me the right answer just like that, especially a girl. You're a little cheat, madame. That's what you are, a cheat and a liar. At that point, the mother came in carrying a large tray on which were 4 suppers. This time it was fish and chips, which Mrs. Wormwood had picked up in the fish and chip shop on her way home from bingo. It seemed that bingo afternoons left her so exhausted both physically and emotionally that she never had enough energy left to cook an evening meal. So if it wasn't TV dinners, it had to be fish and chips. Why are you looking so red in the face about, Harry? She said, and she put the tray down of coffee table. Your daughter's a cheat and a liar, the father said, taking his plate of fish and placing on his knees. Turn the telly on and let's not have any more talk. The Platinum Blonde Man. There was no doubt in Matilda's mind that this last display of faultlessness by her father deserved severe punishment, and as she sat eating her awful fried fish and fried chips and ignoring the television, her brain went to work on various possibilities. By the time she went up to bed, her mind was made up. The next morning she got up early and went into the bathroom and locked the door. As we already know, Mrs. Wormwood's hair always dyed a brilliant platinum blonde, very much the same glistening silvery color as a female tightrope walker's tights in a circus. The big dyeing job was done twice a year, and the hairdressers but every month or so in between. Mrs. Wormwood used to refresh it by giving a rinse in the wash basin with something called platinum blonde hair dye extra strong. This also served to dye the nasty brown hairs that keep growing from the roots underneath. The bottle of platinum blonde hair dye extra strong was kept in the cupboard in the bathroom, and underneath the title of the label were written the words, "Caution, this peroxide, keep away from children." Matilda had read it many times with satisfaction. Matilda's father had a fine crop of black hair which part in the middle and of which they exceedingly proud. Good strong hair, he was fond of saying. Man's there's good strong brain underneath. Like Shakespeare, Matilda had once said to him. Like who? Shakespeare, Daddy. Was he brainy? Yes, Daddy, he has masses of hair, didn't he? He was bald, Daddy, to which this father hand-snapped. If you can't talk this scene, then shut up. Anyway, Mr. Wormwood kept his hair looking bright and strong, or so he thought, by rubbing into the very morning large quantities of a lotion called oil of violets hair tonic. A bottle of the smelly purple mixture always stood on the shelf above the sink in the bathroom, alongside all the toothbrushes, and a very vigorous scalp massage with oil of violets took place daily after shaving was completed. This hair and scalp massage was always accompanied by loud masculine grunts and heavy breathing and gasps of "Ah, that's better, that's the stuff," rubbed right into the roots, which could be clearly heard by Matilda in her bedroom across the corridor. Now, in the early morning privacy of the bedroom, Matilda unscrewed the cap of her father's oil of violets and dipped 3/4 of the contents down the drain. Then she filled the bottle up with her mother's platinum blonde hair dye extra strong. She carefully left enough of her father's original hair tonic in the bottle so that when she gave us a good shake, the whole thing still looked reasonably purple. Then she replaced the bottle on the shelf above the sink, taking care to put her mother's bottle back in the cupboard. So far, so good. At breakfast time, Matilda sat quietly at the dining room table eating her cornflakes. Her brother sat opposite her with his back to the door, devouring hunks of bread smothered with a mixture of peanut butter and strawberry jam. The mother was just outside around the corner in the kitchen, making Mr. Wormwood's breakfast, which always had to be fried eggs on fried bread with 3 pork sausages and 3 strips of bacon and some fried tomatoes. At this point, Mr. Wormwood came noisily into the room. He was incapable of entering any room quietly, especially at breakfast time. He always had to make his appearance felt immediately by creating a lots of noise and clatter. One could almost hear saying him, "It's me, here I come, the great man himself, the master of the house, the wage earner, the one who makes it possible for all the rest of you to live so well. Notice me and pay your respects." On this occasion, he strutted and slapped on his son on the back and shouted, "Well, my boy, your father feels he is in for another great money-making day today in the garage. I've got a little beauties I'm going to flock into the idiots this morning. Where my breakfast? It's coming, treasure." Mrs. Wormwood came from the kitchen. Matilda kept her face bent low over her cornflakes. She didn't dare look up. In the first place, she wasn't at all sure that she was going to see, and secondly, if she did see what she thought she was going to see, she wouldn't trust herself to keep a straight face. The son was looking directly ahead out of the window, stuffing himself with bread and peanut butter and strawberry jam. The father was just moving around to sit at the head of the table when the mother came sweeping out of the kitchen, carrying a huge plate piled high with eggs and sausages and bacon and tomatoes. She looked up. She caught sight of her husband. She stopped dead. When she let out a scream that seemed to lift her right into the air, and she dropped the plate with a crash and a splash onto the floor. Everyone jumped, including Mr. Wormwood. "What the heck matter with you, woman?" he shouted. "Look at the mess you've made on the carpet." "Your hair!" the mother was shrieking, pointing quivering finger at her husband. "Look at your hair! What have you done to your hair? What's wrong with my hair, for heaven's sake?" He said, "Oh my God, Dad, What have you done to your hair?" the son shouted. A splendid noisy scene was building up nicely in the breakfast room. Matilda said nothing. She simply sat there admiring the wonderful effect on her own handiwork. Mr. Wormwood, fine crop of black hair, was now dirty silver, the color, this time, of a tightrope walker's tie that had been washed for the entire circus season. You've dyed it!" shrieked the mother. "Why did you do it, you fool? It looks absolutely frightful. It looks horrendous. You look like a freak." "What the blaze are you all talking about?" the father yelled, putting down the heads to his shear. "I almost certainly have not dyed it." "What do you mean, I've dyed it? What happens to it? Or this some sort of stupid joke?" His face was turning pale green, the color of sour apples. "You must have dyed it that," the son said. "It's the same color of Mom's, only much dirtier looking." "Of course he dyed it," the mother cried. "I can't change color off by itself. What on earth were you trying to do? Make yourself look handsome or something? You look like someone's grandmother gone wrong." "Get me a mirror," the father yelled. "Don't just stand there shrieking at me. Get me a mirror." The mother's handbag lay on a chair at the other of the table. She opened the bag and got out a power compact that had a small round mirror on the inside of the lid. She opened the compact and handed it to her husband. He grabbed it and held it before his face, and it's going to spill most of the powder and all over the front of his fancy tweed jacket. "Be careful," shrieked the mother. "Now you look like you've done. That's my best Elizabeth Arden face powder." "Oh my God!" yelled the face and father, staring into the little mirror. "What happened to me? I look terrible. I look just like you gone wrong. I can't go down to the garage and sell cars like this. How did it happen?" He stared around the room, first at the mother, and at the son and then Matilda. "How could it have happened?" he yelled. "I imagine, Daddy," Matilda said quietly, "that you weren't looking very hard and you simply took Mommy's bottle of hair stuff one off shelf instead of your own." "Of course that's what happened," the mother said. "Well, really, Harry, how stupid can't you get? Why didn't you read the label before you started splashing the stuff all over you?" "Mine's terribly strong. I'm only meant to use 1 tablespoon of it, whole basin of waters, and you've gone and put it all your head neat. It'll probably take your hair off in the end. Your scalp beginning to burn, dear." "You mean I'm going to lose all my hair?" the husband yelled. "I think you will," the mother said. "Peroxide is a very powerful chemical. It's what they put down the laboratory to disinfect the pen, only they give it another name." "What are you saying?" the husband cried. "I'm not a laboratory pen. I don't want to be disinfected. Even diluted like I use it," the mother told him. "It makes a good deal of my hair fall out, so goodness knows what's going to happen to you. I'm surprised it didn't take the whole of the top of your head off." "What shall I do?" wailed the father. Tell me quick what to do before it starts falling out. Matilda said, I'd give it a good wash, Dad, if I were you, with soap and water, but you'll have to be hurry. Will that change the color back? The father asked anxiously. Of course it won't, you twit, the mother said. When what do I do? I can't go around looking like this forever. You'll have to have it dyed black, the mother said. But wasn't it first, or there won't be any there to dye? Right, the father shouted, springing into action. Get me an appointment with your hairdresser this instant for a hair dyeing job. Tell them I'm an emergency. They've got to boot someone else off their lists. I'm going upstairs to wash it now. With that the man dashed out of the room, and Mrs. Wormwood, seeing deeply, went to the telephone to call the beauty parlor. He does some pretty silly things now and then, doesn't he, Mommy? Matilda said. The mother, dialing the number on the phone, said, I'm afraid men are not always quite as clever as they think they are. You will learn when you get a bit older, my girl. Miss Honey. Matilda was a little late in starting school. Most children begin primary school as a 5 or even just before, but Matilda's parents, who weren't concerned one way or the other about their daughter's education, had forgotten to make the proper arrangements in advance. She was 5.5 when she entered the school for the first time. The village school for younger children was a bleak brick building called Bransham Hall Primary School. It had about 250 pupils aged from 5 to just under 12 years old. The head teacher, the boss, the supreme commander of this establishment was a formidable middle-aged lady whose name was Miss Trunchbull. Naturally, Matilda was put in the bottom class, where there were 18 other small boys and girls about the same age as her. Their teacher was called Miss Honey, and she could not have been more than 23 or 24. She had a lovely pale oval Madonna face with blue eyes, and her hair was light brown. Her body was so slim and fragile, one got the feeling that if she fell over, she should smash into 1,000 pieces like a porcelain figure. Miss Jennifer Honey was a mild and quiet person who never raised her voice and was seldom seen to smile, but there is no doubt she possessed the rare gift of being adored by every small child under her care. She seemed to understand totally the bewilderment and fear that so often overwhelms young children who for the first time in their lives are herded into a classroom and told to obey orders. Some curious warmth that was almost tangible shone out of Miss Honey's face while she spoke to a confused and homesick newcomer to the class. Miss Trunchbull, the headmistress, was something else altogether. She was gigantic holy terror, a fierce, tyrannical monster who frightened the life out of pupils and teachers alike. There was an aura of meanness about her even at a distance, and when she came up close, you could almost feel the dangerous heat radiating from her. as from a red-hot rod of metal. When she marched, Miss Trudgebull never walked. She always marched like a storm-trooper, with long strides and arms a-swinging. When she marched along a corridor, you could actually hear her shouting as she went, and if a group of children happened to be in her path, she plucked right on through them like a tank, with small people bouncing off her for a left and right. Thank goodness we don't meet many people like her in this world, although they do exist, and all of us are likely to come across at least one of them in a lifetime. If you never ever do, you should behave as you would if you met an enraged rhinoceros out of the bush. Climb up the nearest tree and stay there until it has gone away. This woman, in all her eccentricities and her all appearance, is the most impossible to describe, but I shall make some attempt to do so a little later on. Let us leave her for some moment and go back to Matilda at her first day in Miss Honey's class. After the usual business of going through all the names of the children, Miss Honey handed out a brand new exercise book to each pupil. "You have all brought your own pencils, I hope," she said. "Yes, Miss Honey," they chanted. "Good. Now, this is the very first day of school for each one of you. It is the beginning of at least 11 long years of schooling that all you are going to have to go through. And 6 of those years will be spent right here in the Crunchman Hall, where, as you know, your headmistress is Miss Trunchbull. Let me, for your own good, tell you something about Miss Trunchbull. She insists upon strict discipline throughout the school, and if you take my advice, you will do your very best to behave yourselves in her presence. Never argue with her. Never answer her back. Always do as she says. If you get on the wrong side of Miss Trunchbull, she can liquidate you like a carrot in a kitchen blender. It's nothing to laugh about, Lavender. Take that grin off your face. All of you will be wise to remember that Miss Trunchbull deals very, very severely with anyone who gets out of the line in this school. Have you got the message?" "Yes, Miss Honey," chirped 18 eager little voices. "I myself," Miss Honey went on, "want to help you to learn as much as possible where you are in this class. This is because I know it will make things easier for you later on. For example, by the end of this week, I shall expect every one of you to know the 2 times table by heart. And in a year's time, I hope you will know all the multiplication tables up to 12. It will help you enormously if you do. Now then, do any of you happen to have learned the 2 times table already?" Matilda put up her hand. She was the only one. Miss Honey looked carefully at the tiny girl with dark hair and round serious face sitting in the second row. "Wonderful," she said. "Please stand up and recite as much of you as you can." Matilda stood up and began to say the 2 times table. When she got to 212, is 24. She didn't stop. When she right on with twice 13 is 26, twice 13 is 28, twice 15 is 30, twice 16 is... Stop, Miss Honey said. She had been listening slightly spellbound to his mouth recital, and now she said, "How far can you go?" "How far?" Matilda said. "Well, I don't know really, Miss Honey, for quite a long way, I think." Miss Honey took a few moments to let the curious statement sink in. "You mean," she said, "that you could tell me what 2 times 28 is?" "Yes, Miss Honey." "What is it?" 56, Miss Honey. "What about something much harder, like 2 times 487? Could you tell me that?" "I think so," Matilda said. "Are you sure?" "Why, yes, Miss Honey, I'm very sure." "What is it then, 2 times 487? 974, Matilda said immediately. She spoke quietly and politely. Miss Honey gazed at Matilda with absolute amazement, but when next she spoke, she kept her voice level. "That is really splendid," she said, "but of course multiplying by 2 is a lot easier than some of the bigger numbers. What about the other multiplication tables? Do you know any of those?" "I think so, Miss Honey. I think I do." "Which ones, Matilda? How far have you got?" "I don't quite know," Matilda said. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean, if you do, for instance, know the 3 times table." "Yes, Miss Honey." "And 3 4 times?" "Yes, Miss Honey." "Well, how many do you know, Matilda? Do you know all the way up to the 12 times table?" "Yes, Miss Honey." "What are 12 sevens?" 84, Matilda said. Miss Honey paused and leaned back in her chair behind the plain table that stood in the middle of the floor in front of the class. She was considerably shaken by his exchange, but took care not to show it. She had never come across a 5-year-old before, or indeed a 10-year-old before, who could multiply with such facility. "I hope the rest of you are all listening to this," she said to the class. "Matilda is a very lucky girl. She has a wonderful parents who have already taught her to multiply lots of numbers." "Was it your mother, Matilda, who taught you?" "No, Miss Honey, it wasn't." "You must have a great father then. He must be a brilliant teacher." "No, Miss Honey," Matilda said quietly. "My father did not teach me." "You mean you taught yourself?" "I don't quite know," Matilda said truthfully. "It's just I don't mind it very difficult to multiply one number by another." Miss Honey took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She looked again at a small girl with bright eyes standing beside her desk, so sensible and solemn. "You say you don't find it difficult to multiply one number by another," Miss Honey said. "Could you try to explain that one little bit?" "Oh dear," Matilda said, "I'm not really sure." Miss Honey waited. That class was silent, all listening. "For instance," Miss Honey said, "if I asked you to multiply 14 by 19. No, that's too difficult." "It's 266, Matilda said softly. Miss Honey stared at her. Then she picked up a pencil and quickly worked out of the song on a piece of paper. "What did you say it was?" she said, looking up. 266, Matilda said. Miss Honey put down her pencil and removed her spectacles and began to polish the lenses with a piece of tissue. The class remained quiet, watching her and waiting for what was coming next. Matilda was still standing up beside her desk. "Now tell me, Matilda," Miss Honey said, still polishing, "try to tell me exactly what goes on inside your head when you get a multiplication like to do. You obviously have to work it in some way, but you seem able to arrive at the answer almost instantly. Take the one you just done, 14 multiplied by 19. I simply put the 14 down in my head and multiplied by 19, Matilda said. "I'm afraid I don't know else how to explain it. I've always said to myself that if I little pocket calculator, can I do it? Why shouldn't I?" "Why not, indeed?" said Miss Honey. "The human brain is an amazing thing. I think it's a lot better than a lump of metal," Matilda said. "That's all a calculator is." "How right you are," Miss Honey said. "Pocket calculator are not allowed in the school anyway." Miss Honey was feeling quite covery. There was no doubt in her mind that she had met a truly extraordinary mathematical brain, and words like child genius and prodigy went flitting through her head. She knew that then sort of wonders to pop up in the word from time to time, but only once or twice in 100 years. After all, Mozart was only 5 when he started composing for the piano, and look what happened to him. "It's not fair," Lavender said. "How can she do it and we can't?" "Don't worry, Lavender. You'll soon catch up," Miss Honey said, lying through her teeth. At this point, Miss Honey could not resist the temptation of exploring this still further the mind of this astonished child. She knew that she ought to be paying some attention to the rest of the class, but she was altogether too excited to let the matter rest. "Well," she said, pretending to address the whole class, "let's leave us sums for a moment and see if you have begun to learn to spell. Hands up, anyone who can spell cat." 3 hands went up. They belonged to Lavender, a small boy called Nigel, and to Matilda. "Spell cat, Nigel." Nigel spelled it. Miss Honey now decided to ask the question that normally she would have dreamed of asking the class on this first day. "I wonder," she said, "whether of you or 3 you know how to spell cat have learned how to read a whole group of words when they are strung together in a sentence." "I have," said Nigel. "So have I," Lavender said. Miss Honey went to the blackboard and wrote with her with chalk the sentence, "I have already begun to learn how to read long sentences." She had purposely made it difficult, and she knew that she were precious for 5 years old around who would be able to manage it. "Can you tell me what that says, Nigel?" she asked. "That's too hard," Nigel said. "Lavender, the first with I." Lavender said. Can you do of you read whole sentence? Miss Honey asked, waiting for the yes. Then she felt certain was going to come from Matilda. Yes, Matilda said. Go ahead, Miss Honey said. Matilda read the sentence without any hesitation at all. That's really very good indeed, Miss Honey said, making the understatement on her life. How much can you read, Matilda? I think I can read most things, Miss Honey, Matilda said, although I'm afraid I can't always understand the meanings. Miss Honey got to her feet and walked smartly out of the room, but was back in 30 seconds, carrying a thin book. She opened it at random and placed it on Matilda's desk. This is a book of humorous poetry, she said. See if you can read the one aloud. Smoothly, without a pause, and at a nice speed, Matilda began to read. An epicure dining at Crewe found a rather large mouse in his stew. Cried the waiter, don't shout, and weave it about, or the rest will be wanting one too. Several children saw the funny side of the rhyme and laughed. Miss Honey said, Do you know what an epicure is, Matilda? It is somehow hastily with his eating, Matilda said. That is correct, Miss Honey said. And do you happen to know what a particular type of poetry it called? It called the limerick, Matilda said. That's a lovely one. It's so funny. And it's a famous one, Miss Honey said, picking up the book and returning to her table in front of the class. A witty limerick is very hard to write, she added. They look easily, but they most certainly are not. I know, Matilda said. I've tried quite a few times, but mine are never any good. You have you? Miss Honey said, more startled than ever. Well, Matilda, I'd like very much to hear one of those limericks you say you have written. Could you try to remember one of those? Well, Matilda said, hesitating, I've actually been trying to make up one about you, Miss Honey, while we've been sitting here. About me? Miss Honey cried. Well, we've certainly got to hear that one, haven't we? I don't think I want to say it, Miss Honey. Please tell us. Miss Honey said, I promise I won't mind. I think you will, Miss Honey, because you have to use your first name to make things rhythm, and that's why I don't want to say it. How do you know my first name? Miss Honey asked. I heard another teacher's calling you by it just before we came in, Matilda said. She called you Jenny. I insist upon hearing the limerick, Miss Honey said, smiling one of her rare smiles. Stand up and recite it. Reluctantly, Matilda stood up and very slowly, very nervously, she recited her limerick. The thing we all ask about Jenny is surely there cannot be many young girls in the place with a lovely face. The answer so that not any. The whole of Miss Honey's pale and pleasant face blushed brilliant scarlet. Then once again she smiled. It was a much broader, on this time a smile of pure pleasure. Why, thank you, Matilda, she said, still smiling. Although it is not true, it is really very good limerick. Oh dear, I must try to remember that one. From the third row of desks, Lavender said, It's good. I like it. It's dressed well, a small boy called Robert said. Of course, true, Nigel said. Already the whole class had begun to warm towards Miss Honey, although as yet she had hardly taken any notice of any of them except Matilda. Who taught you to read, Matilda? Miss Honey asked. I just sort of taught myself, Miss Honey. And have you read any book all by yourself? Any children's book, I mean? I've read all the ones that are in the public library in the High Street, Miss Honey. And did you like them? I like them very much indeed, Matilda said, but I thought others were very dull. Tell me one you liked. I liked The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe, Matilda said. I think Mr. S.C. Lewis is a very good writer, but he has one failing. There are no funny bits in his books. You are right there, Miss Honey said. There aren't many funny bits in Mr. Tolkien either, Matilda said. Do you think the all children's books ought to have funny bits in them? Miss Honey asked. I do, Matilda said. Children are not so serious as grown-ups, and they love to laugh. Miss Honey was astounded by the wisdom of this tiny girl. She said, And what are you going to now that you read all the children's books? I'm reading other books, Matilda said. I borrowed them from the library. Mr. Phelps is very kind to me. She helps me to choose them. Miss Honey was leaning far forward over her work table and gazing in wonder as the child. She had completely forgotten how about the rest of the classes. What other books? She murmured. I'm very fond of Charles Dickens, Matilda said. He makes me laugh a lot, especially Mr. Pickwick. At that moment, the bell in corridor sounded for the end of the class. The Trench Ball. In the interval, Miss Honey left the classroom and headed straight for the headmistress' study. She felt wildly excited. She had just met a small girl who possessed, or who seemed to her, quite extraordinary qualities of brilliance. There had not been time yet to find out exactly how brilliant the child was. The Miss Honey had learned enough to realize that something had to be done about this as soon as possible. It would be ridiculous to leave a child like that stuck in the bottom room. Normally, Miss Honey was terrified of the headmistress and kept well away from her, but this moment she felt ready to take up anybody. She knocked on the door of the dreaded private study. Enter, boomed the deep and dangerous voice of Miss Trunchbull. Miss Honey went in. The most head teachers are chosen because they possess a number of fine qualities. They understand children, and they have the children's best interests at heart. They are sympathetic, they are fair, and they are deeply interested in education. Miss Trunchbull possessed none of these qualities, and how she ever got her present job was a mystery. She was above all a most formidable female. She had once been a famous athlete, and then now the muscles were still clearly in evidence. She could set them in the bold neck, in the big shoulders, and the thick arms, the sinew wrists in the powerful legs. Looking at her, you got the feeling that it was someone who could bend iron bars and tear telephone directions in half. Her face, I'm afraid, was neither a thing of beauty nor a joy forever. She had an upstained chin, a cruel mouth, and small, arrogant eyes. And as for her clothes, they were, to say the least, extremely odd. She always had an old brown cotton smock, which was pinched in around the waist with a white leather belt. The belt was fastened in front with an enormous silver buckle. The massive tights, which emerged from out of the smock, were encased in the pair of extraordinary breeches, bottle green in color and made of coarse twill. These breeches reached to just below the knees, and from there on down she sported green stocking with stern up tops, which displayed her calf muscles to perfection. On her feet she wore flat-heeled brown brogues with leather flaps. She looked, in short, more like a rather eccentric and bloodthirsty follower of the staghounds that headmistress of a nice school for children. When Miss Honey entered the study, Miss Trunchbull was standing beside her huge desk with a look of scowling impatience on her face. "Yes, Miss Honey," she said. "What is it you want? You are looking very flushed and flustered this morning. What's the matter with you? You have those little stinkers been flicking spitballs at you?" "No, headmistress, nothing like that." "Well, what is it then? Get on with it. I'm a busy woman." As she spoke, she reached out and poured herself a glass of water from a jug that was always on her desk. "There was a little girl in my class called Matilda Wormwood," Miss Honey began. "That's the daughter of the man who owns Wormwood Motors in the village." Miss Trunchbull barked. She hardly ever spoke in a normal voice. They barked or shouted. "An excellent person, Wormwood," she went on. It once, there's only yesterday, he sold me a car, almost new, only done 10,000 miles. Previous owner was an old lady who took it out once a year at the most, a terrific burden. Yes, I like Wormwood, a real pillar of our society. He told me the daughter was a bad lot, though. He said to watch her. He said of anything that ever happened in the school, it was certain to be his daughter who did it. I haven't met the little brat yet, but she'll know about it when I do. Her father's such a real wart." "Oh no, headmistress, that can't be right," Miss Honey cried. "Oh yes, Miss Honey, it darn well it's right. In fact, now I come to think of it, I'll bet it was the who put the stink bomb until my desk here first thing in the morning. The place stank like a sewer. Of course it was her. I shall have her for that. You see if I don't. Why, she looks like nasty little worm. I'll be found. I have discovered, Miss Honey, during my long career as a teacher, that a bad girl is a far more dangerous creature than a bad boy. That's more They're much harder to squash. Squashing a bad girl is like trying to squash a blue bottle. You bang down at it and the darn thing isn't there. Nasty, dirty things little girls are. Glad I never was one. Oh, but you must have been a little girl once, Headmistress. Surely you were. Not for long, anyway, Miss Trunchbull barked, grinning. I became a woman very quickly. She's completely off her rocket, Miss Honey told herself. She's balmy and a bedbug. Miss Honey stood resolutely before the headmistress. For once, she was not going to the brown-beaten. I must tell you, headmistress, she said, that you are completely mistaken about Matilda putting a sting bomb onto your desk. I am never mistaken, Miss Honey. But headmistress, this child only arrived in school this morning and came straight to the classroom. Don't argue with me, for heaven's sake, woman. This little brood, Matilda, or whatever her name, it was sting-bombed by study. There's no doubt about it. Thank you for suggesting it. But I didn't suggest it, headmistress. Of course you did. Now what do you want, Miss Honey? Why are you wasting my time? I came to you to talk to Matilda, headmistress. I have extraordinary things to report about the child. May I please tell you what happened in class just now? I suppose she set the fire on your skirt and scorched your knickers, Miss Trunchbull snorted. No, no, Miss Honey cried out. Matilda is a genius. At the mention of this word, Miss Trunchbull's face turned purple, and her whole body seemed to swell up like a bullfrog's. A genius, she shouted. What a puffle! It is you are talking, madam. You must be out of your mind. I have her father's word for it that the child is a gangster. Her father is wrong. Headmistress, don't be a twerp. Miss Honey, you have met a little beast for only half an hour, and her father had known her all her life. But Miss Honey was determined to have her say that she had begun to describe some of amazing things Matilda had done with arithmetic. So she learned a few tables by heart, hasn't she? Miss Trunchbull barked. My dear woman, that doesn't make her a genius. It makes her a parrot. But headmistress, she can read. So can I? Miss Trunchbull snapped. It is my opinion, Miss Honey said, that Matilda should be taken out of Rome and placed immediately in a top form with the 11 years old. Ha! snorted Miss Trunchbull. So you want to get rid of her, do you? So you can't handle her? So now you want to unload her on the wretched Miss Belsmore in the top from that she will cause even more chaos? No, no, cried Miss Honey. That is not reason at all. Oh, yes, it is, she shouted. I can see right through your little plot, madam, and my answer is no. Matilda stays there. It is up to you to see like she behaves herself. But headmistress, please. Not another word, shouted Miss Trunchbull. And in any case, if you have a rule in this school, that the children remain in their own age group regardless of ability. Great Scott, I'm not having a little 5-year-old bride and sitting with the senior girls and boys in the top form. However, heard of such a thing. Miss Honey stood there helpless before this great red-necked giant. There was a lot more she would like to have said, but she knew it was useless. She said softly, "Very well, then. It's up to you, headmistress." "You are darn right. It's up to me," Miss Trunchbull laughed. "And don't forget, madam, they are dealing here with a little viper who put a steam bomb under my desk." "She did not, headmistress." "Of course she did," Miss Trunchbull boomed. "And I'll tell you what, I wish you hadn't. I was still allowed to use the birch and belt as I did in the good old days. I've held roasted Matilda bottom of her so she couldn't sit down for a month." Miss Honey turned and walked out of the study, feeling depressed, but by no means defeated. "I'm going to do something about this child," she told herself. "I don't know what it will be, but I shall find a way to help her in the end." When Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress' study, most of the children were outside in the playground. Her first move was to go round to the various teachers who taught the senior class and borrow from them a number of textbooks, books of algebra, geometry, French, English literature, and the like. Then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. "There is no point," she said, "in you sitting in class doing nothing while I'm teaching the rest of the reform, the 2 times table, and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson I shall give you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson you come up to me with your questions, if you have any, and I shall try to help you. How does that sound?" "Thank you, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "That sounds fine." "I'm sure," Miss Honey said, "that we'll be able to get you moved into a much higher form later on, but for the moment the headmistress wishes you to stay where you are." "Very well, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "Thank you so much for getting those books for me." What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said about her. She seems very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seemed aware of it. So when the class reassembled, Matilda went to her desk and began to study a textbook of geometry which Miss Honey had given her. The teacher kept half an eye of her all the time and noticed that the child very soon became deeply absorbed in the book. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite the reverse. Sometimes it was well nigh impossible for a teacher to convince the proud father and mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be stop them from getting over-enthusiastic. And now Miss Honey's hopes began to expand even further. She started wondering whether permission might not be sought from the parents for her to give private tuition to Matilda after school. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed enormously to her professional instinct as a teacher, and suddenly she decided that she would go and call on Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go very late, between 9 and 10 o'clock, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. And that is precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out to walk from her own home to the Wormwoods' house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street where each smallish building was separated from its neighbors by a bit of garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap to buy, and the name of the gate said Cozy Knock. Nosy Cook might have been better, Miss Honey thought. She was given to playing with words in that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood waiting they could hear the television blaring inside. The door was opened by a small red-looking man with a thin red moustache who was wearing a sport coat that had an orange and red stripe in the material. "Yes," he said, peering out at Miss Honey. "If you're selling raffle tickets, I don't want any." "I'm not," Miss Honey said, "and please forgive me for butting in you like this. I'm Matilda's teacher at school, and it is important I have a word with you and your wife." "Got into trouble already, has she?" Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. "Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You'll have to deal with her." "She's in no trouble at all," Miss Honey said. "I have come with good news about her." "Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in a few minutes to talk about Matilda? We are right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs," Miss Wormwood said. "This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time?" Miss Honey began to lose patience. "Miss Wormwood," she said, "if you think some role on TV programs is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not to be a parent. Why don't you switch the darn thing off and listen to me?" That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken to this way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood so resolutely out of the porch. "Oh, very well then," he snapped. "Come on and let's get it over with." Miss Honey stepped briskly inside. "Mrs. Wormwood isn't going to thank you for this," the man said as he led her into the sitting room where a large platinum blonde woman was gazing restlessly at the TV screen. "Who is this?" the woman said, not looking around. Some school teacher, Mr. Wormwood said. She says she goes to talk to about Matilda. He crossed to the TV set and turned down the sound but left the picture on the screen. Don't do that, Harry, Mrs. Wormwood cried out. Wheeler is just about to propose to Angelica. You can still watch it while we are talking, Mr. Wormwood said. This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some sort of news to give us. My name is Jennifer Honey, Miss Honey said. How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood? Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, What's the trouble then? Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. This, she said, was your daughter's first day at school. We know that, Mrs. Wormwood said, ready about missing her program. Is that all came to tell us? Mrs. Honey stared hard into the other woman's very wet grey eyes, and she allowed the silence to hang up in rain until Mr. Wormwood became uncomfortable. Do you wish me to explain why I came? She said. Get on with it, Dan, Mr. Wormwood said. I'm sure you know, Miss Honey said, that children in the bottom class at school are not expected to be able to read or spell or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5 years old cannot do that, but Matilda can do it all, and if I'm to believe her. I wouldn't, Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still ready at losing the sound on the TV. Was she lying then? Miss Honey said, when she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read. Did either of you teach her? Teach her what? Mr. Wormwood said. To read books. Miss Honey said, perhaps you did teach her. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves full of books all over the house. I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers. Of course we read, Mr. Wormwood said. Don't be so daft. I read the autocar and the motor from cover to cover every week. This child has already read an astonishing number of books, Miss Honey said. I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature. We don't halt with book reading, Mr. Wormwood said. You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks. We don't keep them in the house. I see, Miss Honey said. Well, all I came to tell you is that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I accept you knew that already. Of course I knew she could read, the mother said. She spends her life up in her room, buried in some silly book. But does it not intrigue you? Miss Honey said. That's a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway. Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement? Not particularly, the mother said. I'm not in favor of blue stockings, girl. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Honey. The name is Honey, Miss Honey said. Now look at me, Mrs. Wormwood said. Thank you. You. I choose books. I choose books. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with a smock-suit pudding face who was sitting across the room. What did you say? I said you chose books and I chose looks, Mrs. Wormwood said, and who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you are left slaving away teaching a lot of nasty little children the ABC. Quite right, Sugar Plum, Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife if he could have made a cat sick. Miss Honey decided that if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. I haven't told you all of it yet, she said. Matilda, so far as I can gather all this early stage, is also a kind of mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning. What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator? Mr. Wormwood said. A girl's doesn't get a man by being brainy, Mrs. Wormwood said. Look at that film star for an instance, she added, pointing at the silent TV screen where a boomy female was being embarrassed by a grudgy actor in the moonlight. You don't think she got him to do that the multiplying figures at him, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her, you see, if he doesn't, and she's going to live in a mansion with a bolter and lots of maids. Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had heard that parents like this exist all over the place, and that their children turn out to be dedicants and dropouts, but if it's still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. Matilda's trouble, she said, drawing once again, is that she is so far ahead of everyone else around, and it might be worth thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe that she could brought up to university standard in 2 or 3 years with a proper coaching. University? Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up at his chair. Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn there is bad habits. That's not true, Miss Honey said. If you had a heart attack this minute and had to call a doctor, the doctor would be an university graduate. If you got sued for stealing someone a rotten second-hand car, you'd have to get a lawyer, and he'd be an university graduate too. Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood, but I can see we're not going to agree. I'm sorry I burst in you like this. Miss Honey rose from her chair and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door and said, Good of you to come, Miss Hawkes. Or is it Miss Harris? It's neither, Miss Honey said, but let it go. And away she went, throwing the hammer. The nice thing about Matilda was that if you had met her casually and talked to her, you would have thought that she was a perfectly normal 5.5-year-old child. She displayed almost no outward signs of her brilliance, and she never showed off. This is a very sensible and quiet little girl, you would have said to yourself, and unless for some reason you had started a discussion with her about literature or mathematics, would you never have known the extent of her brain power. It was therefore easy for Matilda to make friends with other children. All those in her class liked her. They knew, of course, that she was clever because they had heard her being questioned by Miss Honey on the first day of term, and they knew also that she was allowed to sit quietly with a book during lessons and not pay attention to the teacher. But children of their age do not search deeply for reasons. They are far too wrapped up in their own small struggles to worry overmuch about what others are going and why. Among Matilda's new-found friends was the girl called Lavender. Right from the first day of term, the two of them started wandering round together during the morning break and in the lunch hour. Lavender's was exceptionally small for her age, a skinny little nymph with deep brown eyes and with dark hair, what was cut in a fringe across her forehead. Matilda liked her because she was gusty and adventurous. She liked Matilda for exactly the same reason. Before the first week of term was up, awesome tales about the headmistress, Miss Trunchbull, began to filter through the newscomers. Matilda and Lavender, standing in a corner of the playground during morning break on the third day, were approached by a rather 10-year-old with a boil on her nose called Hortensia. "Newscomer, I suppose," Hortensia said to them, looking down from her great height. She was eating from an extra large bag of potato crisps and digging the stuff out of handfuls. "Welcome to Borstal," she added, spraying bits of crisps out of her mouth like snowflakes. The two tiny ones, confronted by this giant, keep a watchful silence. "Have you met the Trunchbull yet?" Hortensia asked. "We've seen her at the prayers," Lavender said, "but we haven't met her." "You've got a treat coming to you," Hortensia said. "She hates very small children. She therefore loathes the bottom class and everyone in it. She thinks 5-year-old are grubs that haven't yet hatched out." In went another fistful of crisps, and then she spoke again, outsprayed with crumbs. "If you survive your first year, you may just manage to live through the rest of your time here, but many don't survive. They get carried out of stretchers screaming. I've seen it often." Hortensia paused to observe the effect these remarks were having on or two teacher ones. Not very much. They seemed pretty cool, so the large one decided to regale them with further information. "I suppose you know that Trunchbull has a lock-up cupboard in her private quarters called the Chokey. Have you heard about the Chokey?" Matilda and Lavender shook their heads and continued to gaze up at the giant. Being very small, they were inclined to mistrust any creature that was larger than they are, especially senior girls. "The Chokey," Hortensia went on, "is a very tall but very narrow cupboard. The floor is only 10 inches square, so you can't sit down and squat in it. You have to stand. And 3 of the walls are made of cement, with bits of broken glass sticking out over, so you can't lean against them. You have to stand more or less at attention And why then you get locked up in there? It's terrible. Can't you lean against the door? Matilda asked. Don't be daft, Hortensia said. The doors go thousands of sharp spiky nails tricking out of it. They've been hammered through from the outside, probably by the Trunchbull herself. Have you ever been in there? Lavender asked. My first term, I was in 6 times, Hortensia said. Twice for a whole day, and the other times for 2 hours each. But 2 hours is quite bad enough. It's pitch dark, and you have to stand up dead straight, and if you wobble you get spiked either by the glass of the nails or the nails of the door. Why were you put in? Matilda asked. Why had you done? The first time, Hortensia said. I poured a half a tin of golden syrup onto the seat of the chair the Trunchbull was going to sit on in prayers. It was wonderful. When she lowered herself into the chair, there was loud squelching noise similar to that made by a hippopotamus when lowering its food into the mud on the banks of the Limerick River. But you are too small and stupid to have heard the just so stories, aren't you? I've read them, Matilda said. You're a liar, Hortensia said amiably. You can't even read yet, but no matter. So when the Trunchbull sat down on the golden syrup, the squelch was beautiful. And then she jumped up again. The chair sort of stuck to the seat of those awful green breeches she wears, and came up with her for a few seconds until the thick syrup slowly came unstick. When she clapped her hands to the seat of her breeches, and both hands got covered in the muck. You should have heard her below. But how did she know it was you? Lavender asked. A little squid called Ollie Bonkwas sneaked on me, Hortensia said. I knocked his front teeth out. And the Trunchbull put you in the Chokey for a whole day, Matilda asked, gulping. All day long, Hortensia said. It was off my rocker when she let me out. I was babbling like an idiot. What were the other things? Did you get put in the Chokey? Lavender asked. Oh, I can't remember them all now, Hortensia said. She spoke with air of an old warrior who has been in so many battles that bravery has become commonplace. It is all so long ago, she added, stuffing more crisps into her mouth. Oh, yes, I can remember one. Here's what happened. I chose a time when I knew the Trunchbull was out of the way, teaching the 6th farmers, and I put up my hand and asked go to the box. But instead of going there, I sneaked into the Trunchbull room, and after a speedy search, I found the drawer where she kept all the gem knickers. Go on, Matilda said, spellbound. What happened next? I had sent away my post, you see, for this very powerful engine powder, Hortensia said. It's cost 50p a packet, and it was called the Skin Scorcher. The label said it was made from the powdered teeth of deadly snakers, and it was guaranteed to raise wells of sides of walnuts on your skin. So I spring this stuff inside every pair of knickers in the draught and then folded them up again carefully. Hortensia paused and crammed some more crisps into her mouth. Did it work? Lavender asked. Well, Hortensia said, A few days later, during prayers, the Trunchbull suddenly started scratching herself like mad down below. "Ah," I said to myself, "here we go. She's changed for a gym already." It was pretty wonderful to be sitting there and watching it all, knowing that I was the only person in the whole school who realized exactly what was going inside the Trunchbull's pants. And I felt safe too. I knew I couldn't be caught. Then the scratching got worse. She couldn't stop. She must have thought she had a wasp's nest down there. And then, right in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, she leaped up and grabbed her bottom and rushed out of the room. Both Matilda and Lavender were enthralled. It was quite clear to them that they were at this moment standing in the presence of a master. He was somebody who had brought the art of skullduggery to the highest point of perfection, somebody moreover who was willing to risk life and limb in pursuit